What if I told you the Second World War never truly ended? I'm your guide from forgotten history tales, taking you into jungles where soldiers clung to duty for decades, refusing surrender. Step closer, because their war is about to begin again. The jungle is alive with whispers. The air clings to my skin, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. I can hear the hum of cicadas, endless and shrill, weaving a wall of sound that makes the silence of human absence even heavier. Yet somewhere in this oppressive green maze, a man is watching. His rifle, though rusted by years of monsoon rains, is still clutched with conviction. His uniform, frayed and patched 100 times over, is no costume. It is his armor, his oath. I take you into the heart of a forgotten war, a war that for some never ended. The world declared peace in 1945. Cities celebrated, nations rebuilt. But not everyone heard the news, or perhaps not everyone believed it. For a small number of men, soldiers scattered across remote islands, valleys, and jungles, the war continued for years, sometimes decades. These men were the last soldiers of the Second World War who refused to surrender. Their stories defy time, stretching like ghostly echoes from one century into the next. They lived not in the history books, but in the shadows, hidden, patient, convinced that their duty had not ended. It begins in the Pacific. Imagine the vast sweep of islands stretching across endless ocean like scattered jewels: Guam, Saipan, the Philippines, Palau. Each one was once a battleground, scarred with trenches, machine gun nests, and caves dug deep into the earth. Here, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army dug in, told by their commanders, "Never surrender. Death before dishonor." When the war ended, when the atomic bombs fell, and Japan's Emperor Hirohito spoke the unthinkable words of surrender, not every soldier heard him. Radio signals were weak in the jungles. Leaflets dropped from planes were dismissed as Allied trickery. Orders from Tokyo calling men home felt like impossible fantasies. In those moments of uncertainty, something else took root. Belief. A belief that surrender was betrayal. A belief that to survive was to keep fighting, no matter how long the silence from command stretched. And so, on these islands and in these forests, men disappeared into the undergrowth, ghosts who refused to believe the war had ended. I want you to picture one of them. It is 1950, 5 years after the war. A fisherman in Guam swears he has seen movement in the trees, figures darting like shadows, dressed in faded khaki. By 1955, hunters in the Philippines stumble upon a man who bolts into the forest at the crack of a twig. Decades after the world moved on, locals whispered of soldiers who still roamed, still carrying their rifles, still scavenging for food. But these were not myths. They were men. Men like Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, stationed in the Philippines. Men like Shoichi Yokoi, who lived in Guam's jungle for nearly 3 decades. And men like Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese conscript who remained hidden on Morotai Island until 1974. Their existence was not simply survival. It was a creed. They stitched their uniforms from jungle fibers. They stole food from farms at night. They left traps for locals they thought were enemies. They carried out reconnaissance missions, writing reports in notebooks that no superior officer would ever read. In their minds, the war had never ended. Imagine the psychological weight of such a life. The days blurred into years, the seasons repeating like a drumbeat of duty. Every rumor of surrender was dismissed as lies. Every newspaper found in a village was seen as propaganda. To surrender, they believed, would be to betray their country, their families, and the spirits of their fallen comrades. And so they endured, not as soldiers on a battlefield, but as phantoms in a jungle that itself became their fortress. There is something haunting, almost mythic, about these figures. They are not just soldiers. They are embodiments of loyalty stretched beyond reason. In a sense, they became living relics of an empire that no longer existed. They clung to its ideals long after it had collapsed. When they were finally discovered, one by one, emerging from the trees with rifles still ready, the world saw them with a mixture of awe and sadness. They were warriors out of time, torn from one century and dropped into another, as if history itself had forgotten to collect them. But before we reach those moments of discovery, we must journey through their long years of solitude, their battles not against enemy armies, but against hunger, disease, and doubt. I stand with you now at the edge of that jungle, listening to the rustle of unseen figures, feeling the weight of decades in the humid air. The war has ended for the world, but for the men inside, it has not. Somewhere in the shadows, a soldier still watches, still waits, still believes, and so the question lingers. What happens to a man when loyalty outlives the war itself? Would you like me to continue Section 2 focusing on Shoichi Yokoi of Guam, the soldier who survived 28 years alone in the jungle? Or should I expand first on the broader phenomenon of multiple soldiers being found across islands before moving into individual stories? Continue the story while maintaining a strong, logical flow that connects seamlessly with the previous part. The transition should feel natural and engaging, ensuring the narrative unfolds smoothly without feeling episodic. Every event must build directly upon the last, leading toward the next development without abrupt shifts. Follow these guidelines. Section. Insert section number. Keep the narrative tightly connected to the previous section, as if the story never stopped. Ensure the timeline remains strong and coherent. No unnecessary jumps or diversions. The tone, pacing, and style must match the established cinematic first-person flow. Maintain suspense and intrigue while naturally guiding the story toward the next key moment. Avoid headlines or section breaks. The story should feel continuous and immersive, end with a haunting or suspenseful line that sets up the next part. The cicadas fade into the distance as I push deeper into the jungle of Guam, tracing the faint path of a man who refused to be found. His name was Shoichi Yokoi, a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army who vanished in 1944 during the American assault on the island. When the guns fell silent, when victory banners were raised, when the world turned its gaze to reconstruction, Yokoi did not walk into captivity. He walked into the shadows. I imagine him in those first days after the battle. Mud smeared across his face, the echo of artillery still ringing in his ears. His unit destroyed, his commanders gone, his world fractured. In the chaos, survival became instinct. He retreated into the dense thicket where twisted roots and towering bamboo formed a barricade against the outside world. There, in the hush of the forest, he made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of his life. He would not surrender. The leaflets fell like snow from the sky, fluttering through the branches, announcing that the war was over. But in Yokoi's eyes, they were lies. The Americans were clever, he thought. This was psychological warfare, an attempt to draw him out, to make him betray the emperor. Newspapers found in abandoned huts spoke of peace, of Japan rising again, but Yokoi could not believe it. He told himself that the empire still fought on, that his duty was to endure in silence until orders came. His days became a ritual of survival. I see him crouched in the river at dusk, setting traps for eels and shrimp, careful to leave no trace of his presence. He weaves fibers into cloth, sewing a crude uniform to replace the one that time devoured. He burrows into the earth itself, carving a hidden den beneath the jungle floor, a shelter just large enough for his body to lie down. In that earthen tomb, damp and suffocating, he sleeps lightly, always ready to vanish into the night at the sound of footsteps. Years passed, and with them, the world changed beyond recognition. Jet engines cut across skies he never saw. Televisions flickered in homes he could not imagine. A new Japan emerged, prosperous, democratic, unrecognizable to the soldier who clung to its imperial ghost. Yet Yokoi remained, a solitary warrior locked in 1944, each sunrise another act of defiance against time itself. Loneliness gnawed at him, but he was not entirely alone. In the early years, a few comrades shared his exile, scattered across the jungle, bound by the same oath. They whispered by firelight, rationed meager food, and watched the horizon for enemies that never came. But one by one, they were gone, some succumbing to disease, others daring to step into villages, captured or killed. By the 1960s, Yokoi was the last, a single soldier left to fight an invisible war. Think of the weight of those decades. 28 years spent hiding, waiting, doubting, yet never yielding. Each time he stole a papaya from a farm, he risked discovery. Each time he heard voices echo through the trees, he pressed himself into the soil, heart thundering in his chest, convinced that American patrols still hunted him. His existence was not just survival. It was a testament to the endurance of belief, even when belief defies all reason. And then, in January 1972, the jungle finally released him. Two local hunters stumbled upon him near the Talafofo River. Startled, Yokoi tried to attack with his handmade spear, but he was overpowered. As they led him from the forest, his eyes blinked against a world he had not seen for nearly 3 decades. He muttered, with words that carried both shame and pride, "It is with much embarrassment that I have returned alive." Those words cut deep. They revealed the weight of his indoctrination, the code that had been etched into him as a soldier of the empire. For him, survival was not triumph. It was failure. He had lived when he was meant to die. He had endured when honor demanded sacrifice. Yet, to the world that greeted him, he was no failure. He was a living relic, a man pulled through time, embodying the devotion and tragedy of a war long ended. When Yokoi returned to Japan, he stepped into a nation utterly transformed. Neon lights painted the streets of Tokyo. Bullet trains screamed through valleys. Skyscrapers stretched into the clouds. Crowds gathered to see him, weeping, bowing, offering gifts. He had lived as if frozen in amber, and now he was displayed like a time capsule cracked open. But behind his quiet bowing, behind his frail body and sunken cheeks, lingered a truth as haunting as the jungle itself. He had lost nearly 30 years to a war that no longer existed. And yet, Yokoi was not the last. Across the Pacific, other soldiers still waited in silence, clinging to the same belief that had guided him. The war had ended, but in forgotten corners of the earth, the jungle still held its prisoners. I can almost hear them, unseen figures in the undergrowth, rifles rusting in their hands, eyes fixed on a horizon where the empire might still rise again. If Yokoi could endure until 1972, what other ghosts still moved through the shadows? The story does not pause as we leave Yokoi behind. It only deepens. His return in 1972 shocked the world, but it also forced a haunting question into the open. If one man could remain hidden for nearly 30 years, how many others were still out there, still carrying their rifles, still refusing to surrender? The answer came not long after, on another island, in another jungle, where time itself seemed suspended. I take you now to Lubang Island in the Philippines. The air here is thick with salt and damp heat, a place where the jungle breathes like a living creature. In the shadows of its palms and tangled vines, a soldier named Hiru Onoda carried out his mission. Unlike Yokoi, Onoda was no ordinary conscript. He had been trained in intelligence and guerrilla tactics, ordered explicitly never to surrender, never to take his own life, but to hold his ground until superior command released him. Those words became his scripture. When the war ended in 1945, Onoda and a handful of men retreated deep into the wilderness. They saw the leaflets, heard the shouts of villagers calling that the war was over. But to them, this was the enemy's trickery. Onoda's training told him the truth could not be trusted. He explained to his comrades that the world would try to deceive them, that their duty was to doubt everything except their orders, and so they remained. The jungle became their outpost. By day, they hid in the thick foliage. By night, they crept into fields, stealing rice, coconuts, and cattle from the local farmers. They mended their uniforms with scraps of cloth, polished their rifles, and wrote reports of their patrols, reports that would never reach Tokyo. Each skirmish with locals convinced them the war continued. Each shot fired from a farmer's shotgun only proved in their minds that the Americans still occupied the island. As the years turned into decades, the small unit dwindled. One by one, Onoda's comrades fell, some killed in clashes with villagers, others taken by disease. By the early 1970s, he was alone, a single figure moving silently through the jungle, still carrying out reconnaissance missions against an enemy that no longer existed. Imagine him crouched among the undergrowth, notebook in hand, writing of troop movements and supply lines, while just miles away, transistor radios blared pop songs and markets bustled with the rhythms of peacetime life. The world searched for him. Planes dropped photographs of his family, newspapers, and even personal letters. Yet Onoda dismissed them all. Fabrications, he thought. Clever propaganda to lure him from his post. His faith in the mission, in the emperor, in the words of his long-gone commander, was unshakable. It would take something extraordinary to break that faith. In 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki set out into the Philippines with a simple but daring goal: to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. Astonishingly, he succeeded in the first. Deep in the jungle, Suzuki encountered the weary soldier. They spoke cautiously, Onoda still armed and suspicious. Suzuki explained that the war was over, that Japan had changed, that he must come home. But Onoda refused. He had his orders. Without a direct command from his superior officer, he would never surrender. And so, in a scene almost too surreal to believe, the Japanese government located Onoda's former commander, now a bookseller in Japan, and flew him to Lubang Island, dressed in his old uniform. The retired officer stood before his lost soldier and gave the order. Onoda, the war is over. You are relieved of your duty. Only then, nearly 30 years after the guns had fallen silent, did Hiru Onoda lower his weapon. When he emerged from the jungle in March 1974, the world was stunned. He wore the same uniform, patched and faded, and carried a rifle still in working condition. His salute was crisp, his discipline unbroken. To him, the war had lasted 29 years. To everyone else, he had been fighting a ghost. I imagine the silence that must have fallen in that moment. Villagers staring at the man who had haunted their island for decades, journalists scrambling to capture every detail, Onoda himself blinking into a world that had outrun him. Tokyo welcomed him as a hero, though many whispered of tragedy. Some praised his loyalty. Others pitied his lost years. For Onoda, there was no triumph in surrender, only the heavy weight of time he could never reclaim. Yet even as the world marveled at his return, rumors stirred of others. If Yokoi could last until 1972, if Onoda until 1974, who else might still be hiding in forgotten corners of the Pacific, clutching a rifle, waiting for orders that would never come? The war was over. Yes, but the jungle still whispered its secrets. And somewhere beyond Onoda's shadow, another soldier waited, unseen, carrying the silence of a forgotten empire. The jungle seems endless, doesn't it? Each story drags us further into its green labyrinth, where time folds in on itself and decades blur into an eternal war. Yokoi in Guam, Onoda in the Philippines. Both men dragged through nearly 30 years of shadow fighting. Yet even their sagas were not the final chapters. For still, in another corner of the Pacific, another soldier clung to the silence of orders never rescinded. His name was Teruo Nakamura, and his exile would last until the end of 1974. Nakamura's tale begins far from the jungles where he vanished. Born in Taiwan, he was not ethnically Japanese, but a conscript in the Imperial Army's Takasago volunteer unit, composed largely of indigenous Taiwanese men. To Tokyo, he was a soldier. To himself, perhaps, he was something more complicated, a man caught between nations, swept into the machinery of empire. But once the order was given, once the oath was sworn, Nakamura became what the war demanded, a ghost to be left behind. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Nakamura was stationed on the Indonesian island of Morotai. For much of the war, it had been a battleground, bombers overhead, artillery shaking the earth. But when the silence came, he did not emerge. Like Onoda and Yokoi, Nakamura mistrusted the voices crying peace. He retreated deep into the jungle, where the forest canopy shut out the world. And he waited. Days turned into years, and the years became decades. Picture him there, alone among the endless palms, the air heavy with salt carried from the sea. His shelter was a crude hut, woven from bamboo and grass. His world reduced to the immediate needs of hunger and survival. He grew bananas and sweet potatoes, trapped small animals, and collected rainwater in carved-out wood. The rhythm of his days must have been monotonous, but beneath it pulsed an iron conviction that the war was not yet finished, and that he, even abandoned, was still a soldier. Unlike Onoda, Nakamura had no comrades to lean on, no notebook filled with reconnaissance reports to sustain his sense of mission. His war was one of silence. 29 years without the sound of command, 29 years with nothing but the rustling trees and his own thoughts to remind him of who he was meant to be. And then, in December 1974, his long exile shattered. An Indonesian search team discovered his hut, hidden in the jungle. Nakamura was captured, thin, weary, but alive. For nearly 3 decades, he had survived in the shadows, unseen by the world that had moved so far ahead of him. His return, however, was different from the reception Yokoi or Onoda received. Japan had by then remade itself into a thriving economic power. But Nakamura was not Japanese by blood. He was Taiwanese. And when he was brought back, there was little fanfare. No parades, no triumphant welcome at the airport. Only a quiet, subdued recognition that yet another lost soldier had finally stepped out of the jungle's grip. There is something unbearably poignant in Nakamura's fate, a man conscripted into an empire that had crumbled, forgotten by both the nation he fought for and the land he returned to. He was granted a modest sum of money, far less than the pensions awarded to Onoda or Yokoi. To many, he was not a hero, but a relic, a reminder of a war that had pulled men from the farthest corners of Asia, used them, and abandoned them. And yet, his endurance was no less extraordinary. Like the others, Nakamura had carried the impossible burden of belief, a belief that outlasted peace itself. His name is less remembered, his story less celebrated, but in his obscurity lies a truth that glimmers darkly. Loyalty does not always end with recognition. Sometimes it ends in silence, forgotten by the very people to whom it was once given. By the mid-1970s, it seemed the long saga of Japan's holdouts had come to an end. Yokoi, Onoda, Nakamura, these names echoed across the world, their tales haunting reminders of how war imprints itself on men's minds, how ideology and duty can warp into a prison stronger than any chain. The jungle had finally released them. The last soldiers had come home. Or had they? Because in the years that followed, whispers continued to surface. Reports trickled in from villagers in the Philippines, from farmers on remote islands, shadowy figures seen in the trees, old rifles glinting in the moonlight. Some were dismissed as myth, others as mistaken identity. But every so often, rumors carried weight. Search parties were dispatched, investigations launched. Could it be, people wondered, that there were still more soldiers hiding out there, still gripping their rifles, still waiting for orders that would never come? The thought is unsettling, that long after the bombs had fallen and treaties were signed, the war might still flicker on in forgotten corners, fought by men who refused to believe in its end. That perhaps, even now, as we stand in the present, some echo of that lost war still lingers in the shadows. And so, we are left at the edge of another mystery. The last confirmed soldier, Nakamura, emerged in 1974. But were there others? Were there men who vanished so completely into the jungle that no search team ever found them? Did some die in silence, their bones swallowed by the earth, their rifles rusting away under the canopy? Or, most haunting of all, did some remain, alive for years longer, shadows unseen, phantoms who never came home? I can almost hear them still, the soft crunch of a footstep on damp soil, the rustle of branches as a figure slips through the trees, a ghost of a war that refuses to die. The jungle has released its captives, one by one, Yokoi, Onoda, Nakamura. Yet as their stories unfolded, a question gnawed at the world's imagination. Were they truly the last? Or were there still others, silent and unseen, wandering the shadows of forgotten islands, carrying a war in their hearts that the world had long since buried? It is easy to imagine the war ending in a single thunderclap. 2 atomic bombs, an emperor's voice on the radio, a nation's surrender. But war never ends so neatly. It lingers in the bodies of men, in the quiet places where duty has taken root. And so, for years after 1974, reports continued to emerge. Farmers claimed to see footprints in the mud. Fishermen whispered of stolen crops and tools vanishing in the night. Hunters swore they glimpsed figures moving with military precision through the brush. In the Philippines, rumors circulated of Japanese stragglers on Mindoro, Palawan, and even remote corners of Luzon. Search teams were sent, sometimes led by veterans of the Imperial Army, men now gray-haired and stooped, calling out into the wilderness for comrades who may or may not still exist. Sometimes they found nothing but the silence of the trees. Sometimes they found graves. And sometimes just enough evidence, a carved shelter, a rusted bayonet, a carefully hidden cooking pit, to keep the hope, or perhaps the dread, alive. One story in particular chills me still. In 1980, more than 35 years after the war, 2 men were reportedly discovered in the jungles of Mindoro. They had been living in seclusion since 1945, believing the war still raged. Accounts of their discovery are hazy, lost in a mix of press reports, rumors, and official silence. Some say they surrendered quietly. Others suggest they slipped away, refusing to believe even then. What remains is not certainty, but the echo of possibility. That the war's shadows extended even further than we dared to think. The mind wrestles with the idea. Could men truly carry such conviction for so long? But then, I remind myself of Yokoi, bowing with shame for having survived, of Onoda, demanding his commander's order nearly 30 years later, of Nakamura, building a world of bamboo and silence because he could not conceive of surrender. When belief is absolute, when it becomes one's very identity, it can outlast empires. And yet, these late whispers raise another haunting thought. How many never emerged at all? How many died in the depths of the forest, unmarked, their remains swallowed by vines, their rifles rusting away, their names lost to history, their families never knowing, their nations never recording, their war never ending? The villagers who told these tales of shadows and phantoms, perhaps some were mistaken, yes, but perhaps not. Perhaps a handful of men truly remained into the 1980s, maybe even beyond, living on the edge of myth. Imagine a soldier, his beard gray, his eyes still sharp, still scanning the horizon for an enemy that would never come. Imagine him hearing the distant crack of modern gunfire, not a battle, but a hunter's rifle, and believing even then that his orders had not yet expired. There is a mythic quality to these stories, yes, but myths are not born from nothing. They sprout from kernels of truth, and the truth here is undeniable. For decades, men clung to the war in the silence of jungles and valleys, decades after nations had moved on. If a few slipped further, unseen, who are we to doubt it? As the 20th century rolled forward, the world became fascinated not just with these holdouts themselves, but with what they represented. Writers, filmmakers, historians, all asked the same question. What kind of mind, what kind of faith, can bind a man so tightly that he resists the pull of time itself? Some saw in them madness, others saw heroism. Perhaps it was both. For loyalty pushed past reason becomes indistinguishable from obsession. And so, by the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, the search for the last soldier became less about locating an individual and more about reckoning with what these men symbolized. They were the final tragic embers of a global firestorm. They were the stubborn shadows of a war that refused to stay in the past. They were the ultimate testament that surrender does not always come with treaties. It must also come from within. But not all could surrender. Some, perhaps, never did. Their stories may never be told, their faces never seen, their final breaths taken under the canopy of trees that became both their prison and their home. The war ended on paper, yes, but in the human heart, in these lonely jungles, it stretched on like an echo that refuses to fade. And so, I am left with a question that chills me more than any confirmed tale. If a war can last 30 years inside a single man, how long can it last inside the world itself? The jungle is quieter now. By the time we reach the late 20th century, most of the confirmed holdouts had either been discovered, captured, or coaxed back into a world they no longer recognized. But as their stories surfaced, another battle began. This time not of rifles and bayonets, but of memory and meaning. Because the question was no longer, were there more? It became something deeper. What do these men truly represent? I close my eyes and imagine the world into which Shoichi Yokoi, Hiroo Onoda, and Teruo Nakamura emerged. Neon signs flickering above crowded Tokyo streets, families gathered around televisions, watching news of moon landings and Olympic Games, factories roaring with the sounds of an economic miracle. And in the middle of it all, a soldier in a frayed uniform steps forward, blinking against the modern glare, carrying a rifle from another century. For the people who welcomed them home, these men were more than just curiosities. They were symbols. Yokoi was embraced as a model of endurance, his humble life in the jungle seen as a testament to simplicity and sacrifice. Onoda was both admired and criticized. Admired for his loyalty, criticized for the violence his mission had inflicted on innocent villagers during those decades. Nakamura, meanwhile, was almost forgotten, his story tinged with the cruel reality of empire's hierarchy, honored less because he had not been born Japanese, and yet, across the world, their names struck chords far beyond Japan. To some, they were heroes, living proof of the human capacity for duty. To others, they were tragic relics, men who had sacrificed decades to illusions, robbed of their lives by a war that should have ended in 1945. And to still others, they were warnings of what blind loyalty, unchecked and unquestioned, can do to the human soul. Imagine the psychological prisons these men carried. Each sunrise in the jungle reinforced their certainty. Each rustle in the trees fed their suspicion. They built entire worlds around the idea that surrender was impossible, that peace was a trap. Their reality diverged from the world's until the line between duty and delusion disappeared. When Onoda wrote his nightly reconnaissance reports, he wasn't lying to himself. He believed. When Yokoi bowed in shame for surviving, he wasn't performing. He felt that dishonor. These were not empty gestures. They were truths carved into their minds by years of conditioning. And this is what makes their stories more than just curiosities of history. They become mirrors. Mirrors that force us to ask, how long can belief sustain a human being? How far can ideology stretch before it devours the life it was meant to guide? These men are mythic, not because they were superhuman, but because they show us how fragile the line is between conviction and obsession. But there is another layer, one darker still. Consider the villagers whose lives overlapped with these holdouts. To them, these men were not legends. They were threats. Onoda and his companions killed farmers, burned crops, and waged small, desperate raids well into the 1970s. Families lived in fear of shadows moving at night, of soldiers who refused to let go of a war everyone else had forgotten. The myth of loyalty, so celebrated by some, was also the reality of violence for those who bore the cost. It is a paradox. Heroes to some, ghosts to others, figures of awe and of tragedy, symbols of devotion and of cruelty. In the end, perhaps they were all of these things at once. The world changed around them, but in their refusal, they forced that world to confront its own scars. The holdouts became reminders that wars are not truly finished with treaties or ceremonies. Wars linger in jungles, in families, in the minds of men who cannot let go. By the 1980s, whispers of remaining stragglers dwindled. Few believed that more could exist, and even fewer had the will to search. But the fascination never faded. Films were made, books written, and journalists trekked into old battlegrounds, chasing phantoms of the past. What they found, again and again, was the same unsettling truth, that time does not erase war. It only buries it beneath layers of silence, waiting for someone to dig it back up. As I think of these soldiers, I hear the hum of the jungle once more, the cicadas, the dripping leaves, the distant rumble of waves against the shore. But now the jungle feels emptier, as though the last ghosts have slipped away. And yet, part of me wonders, if one night, far from the villages, in the deep heart of some forgotten island, a man still crouched in the shadows, rifle in hand, eyes searching for an enemy that never came, would we ever know? History says the last soldiers surrendered in 1974, but silence leaves room for mystery, and mystery leaves room for fear. The world insists that the war ended in 1945, but as we have walked together through these jungles, through the hidden dens and overgrown shelters, we've seen how war clings, how it embeds itself like shrapnel in the minds of men. Even as Yokoi, Onoda, and Nakamura emerged, the myth of the holdout refused to die. For what these men left behind was not only their rifles and uniforms, it was an enduring question. What do we make of them? Were they the last true samurai, clinging to a code of honor that transcended time? Or were they, as others say, victims of an ideology that demanded loyalty, even unto madness? I walk with you now through Tokyo, years after Onoda's return. Crowds filled the streets when he arrived, some cheering, some silent with unease. He stood there, straight-backed in his tattered uniform, saluting an emperor who no longer commanded armies, only memories. And as cameras flashed, the debate erupted across Japan. For some, Onoda was a living testament to Bushido, the ancient warrior spirit of loyalty, sacrifice, and perseverance. In a Japan that had transformed into an economic giant, obsessed with technology and progress, he was a reminder of older values, unyielding devotion, discipline, faith. To those who felt modern life had become soft, Onoda was a relic of strength, but for others, he was a cautionary tale. He had spent 3 decades waging a phantom war, killing innocent villagers who were simply trying to farm their land. He had sacrificed the best years of his life for orders that had long since lost their meaning. And his return forced Japan to look once more into the mirror of its militarist past, a past it had tried hard to bury beneath neon lights and skyscrapers. This duality clung to all of them. Shoichi Yokoi, who lived so humbly in his jungle den, became a symbol of simplicity. He married after his return, gave speeches, and urged people to live modest lives. His very survival seemed to argue for a way of being that modern Japan was forgetting. Nakamura, on the other hand, slipped into obscurity. He had not been Japanese, only a conscript from Taiwan, and so the empire that had once demanded his life offered him little recognition in return. His survival was extraordinary, but his welcome was muted, almost cold. And then there was the wider world, which looked on with astonishment. In Europe and America, the stories of these men seemed almost unbelievable, like fables from another age. The war had been history for decades, and yet here were soldiers stepping out of jungles as though time itself had forgotten to move. The press branded them stragglers, ghost soldiers, the last of the samurai. They were covered with awe and with pity, their faces splashed across front pages, their voices echoing with words that felt alien in the modern age. But beneath all the spectacle lies something darker. Because these men remind us that war does not vanish when the treaties are signed. It lingers in the minds of those who cannot accept its end. It festers in the corners of memory, in ideologies that refuse to die. The holdouts are extreme examples, yes, but they are also symbols of how humanity carries war forward long after the battles are done. I think of Onoda, finally persuaded by his commander to lay down his arms, and how he later moved to Brazil to live quietly on a farm. I think of Yokoi, bowing in shame and saying it was embarrassing to return alive. I think of Nakamura, forgotten by nearly everyone. Each of them carried a different weight, yet all were bound by the same chain, loyalty turned into prison. And even now, as I tell their stories, I feel that chain tugging at the present. Because loyalty, obedience, and belief are not relics of the past. They are forces alive in our world today. The holdouts of the Second World War are gone, but the lesson they embody is not. The jungle may be silent now, its shadows emptied of soldiers, but the echo of their footsteps, the whisper of their duty, still lingers. It reminds us that the past is never fully gone. It hides, waiting to return, waiting to test us again. And so I ask, if men could fight for 30 years after the war had ended, what ghosts of war still live among us today, unseen, unrecognized, waiting for their moment to rise? The jungle has gone quiet. The rifles are rusting now, the makeshift shelters rotted back into the soil. Yokoi, Onoda, Nakamura, their names linger like the last echoes of a dying bell. But as the final shadows of the holdouts fade, we are left with the most haunting part of their story, what it tells us about ourselves. Because their lives were not just about survival. They were about belief. Belief so absolute it could blind a man to the passage of time, strip him of 30 years, and yet still make him stand tall in tattered uniform, saluting an emperor who had long since become a figurehead. Their faith turned jungles into fortresses, turned silence into orders, turned decades into an extension of a war already lost. When I think of Shoichi Yokoi bowing in shame, saying it was embarrassing to return alive, I feel the crushing weight of a man who lived by a code that offered no redemption for survival. When I picture Onoda, writing reconnaissance reports in notebooks no one would read, I see the tragic power of discipline detached from reality. And when I remember Nakamura, forgotten by history, I see the cruel indifference of an empire that demanded everything of him and returned nothing. Their stories are extraordinary, yes, but they are not just curiosities of history. They are warnings, because what we see in these men is the terrifying strength of conviction when it refuses to yield to reason. Their endurance shows the human capacity for loyalty, but also the danger of loyalty without question. For villagers in the Philippines who lost loved ones to Onoda's raids, his name is not remembered as honor, but as fear. For Nakamura, the jungle was not a shrine of duty, but a prison built out of forgotten promises. For Yokoi, survival itself became dishonor. This is why their legend unsettles us, because it forces us to ask, where is the line between devotion and delusion, between honor and tragedy, between survival and loss? The myth of the last soldier resonates far beyond the jungles of Guam, Lubang, or Morotai. It speaks to how war never truly ends. It seeps into generations, reshapes nations, and lingers in the psyche of those who lived it. For some, the war ends when the treaty is signed. For others, it ends only when the last order is rescinded. And for a few, it never ends at all. Even today, their faces stare back at us from faded photographs, caught between centuries, their uniforms patched with vines, their rifles clutched against the inevitable tide of time. They remind us that history is not just something written in books. It is something carried in the minds of men, long after the world has tried to move on. And so, As the curtain closes on this tale, I leave you with this image: a lone soldier in a jungle, standing at the edge of a clearing, listening to the world beyond the trees. He cannot hear the laughter of post-war children. He cannot see the cities rising from ruins into neon futures. All he knows is the silence of his orders, the endless hum of cicadas, and the unyielding certainty that somewhere, somehow, the war still goes on. The world may forget its battles, but the soldiers who lived them never do. And sometimes, neither do their ghosts. This is the story of the last soldiers of World War II who refused to surrender. Men who fought not against enemies, but against time itself. Men who show us that even when peace is declared, war does not always die. It lingers, waiting in the silence, ready to remind us that history never truly lets go. The jungle has gone still now. But if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear it. The faint rustle of a man moving through the undergrowth, a rifle in his hand, duty in his heart, fighting a war that ended long ago. And that is the most haunting truth of all, that sometimes wars never end.